The atmosphere was festive when the Guy family sat down for Thanksgiving dinner on November 24th, 2016 in Knoxville, Tennessee. Even though the family was preparing for some very big changes and starting the next chapter of their life, and despite some small unexpected events, things were fairly normal. Those changes specifically were that the family heads, Lisa and Joel Guy Sr., decided to finally put a life of hard work behind them and start their well-earned retirement. And those unexpected events? Joel Jr., Joel Sr., and Lisa's son had shown up unexpectedly the day before Thanksgiving. Needing to serve one more person during the feast that American Thanksgiving isn't really that much of a derailment to plans, but there was something a little off. Joel Jr. wasn't really the type to engage with his family much, and when he lived at the home in Knoxville, he was prone to staying in his room. He just didn't really partake in the normal conversation or activities that the rest of the family did, and over time became a bit of an outsider. This wasn't due to any sort of mistreatment from his parents or the rest of the family, and in fact, it was quite the opposite. Joel Jr. had never worked a paying job in his life. His parents had paid for everything that he needed and wanted that they could reasonably provide. You see, Joel Jr.'s parents loved their son, wholly and unconditionally. This Thanksgiving, Joel Jr. showed up unannounced, and no one had any clue he would be joining the rest of them for the holiday. Joel had driven nearly 10 hours from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he attended Louisiana State University, to join his family in Knoxville for Thanksgiving. And on this Thanksgiving, Joel's behavior was especially peculiar. Even though the house was full of extended family, many of whom had no real relationship with Joel didn't hole himself up in his room. In fact, his half-sister Michelle even recalled that he was talking and playing with his nieces and nephews, and even gave away some of his childhood toys. A seemingly harmless change in behavior, albeit unusual. About a month prior to Thanksgiving, Joel Sr. and Lisa announced that they would be retiring during a family gathering. Everyone celebrated and expressed how happy they were for the couple. Everyone except Joel Jr. At some point during that gathering, Joel Jr. learned that after 28 years of suckling on the teat of his parents' bank accounts, he would have to begin supporting himself. The fine details have never surfaced, so it's impossible to say exactly how the conversation went or what Joel Jr.'s reaction was, but soon Joel Jr. would let the world know exactly how he felt about his new circumstances. The Saturday after Thanksgiving, on November 26th, Lisa Guy left the home to get groceries and pet supplies for the week. While putting down the last few bags by the door, Lisa went upstairs. Suddenly, Lisa was stabbed over and over again until her life was completely drained from her body. 9 of her ribs were severed in the vicious attack. The person behind the knife? Her own baby boy, Joel Guy Jr. Moments prior, while Lisa was shopping, Joel Jr.'s attack on his family had already begun. Upstairs was an exercise room, where Joel Jr. began his assault on his father. The two struggled throughout the encounter, knocking over a Bowflex machine and damaging the blinds in the process. Joel Sr. would succumb to the 40-plus stab wounds he sustained as well, right there on the second floor of the family home, only meters away from where Lisa would meet her end as well. Joel then began carrying out his plan to dispose of the bodies and to frame his father for the crime as well. He was past the point of no return. There was no turning back. Joel had actually written so many of his plans and details in a journal that during the prosecution it would be referred to as the Book of Premeditation. With his parents slain, the disposal phase of his monstrous plans came next. His initial plan was to plant his mother's DNA evidence on his father and under his nails so that it looked like a domestic dispute gone terribly wrong. His plan would coalesce with him burning down the house in the aftermath to hide any shred of evidence he may have left behind. His father's clothing was cut from his body and left near where he was killed. 2 large knives lay nearby, and a bloodied pack of cigarettes lay on top of the clothes pile. His mother's clothes were cut in the same manner, left by several tubs of sewer line cleaner. On Monday, the next day, Lisa didn't show up for work. This was her last week, and her coworkers had planned a send-off party to celebrate her well-earned retirement, and Lisa was well aware of this fact. Her coworkers would tell investigators, as well as the court, that this was something she wouldn't have missed. It was uncharacteristic of her to not show up for work, and downright alarming if she didn't notify anyone, and there was something planned especially for her. Her supervisor tried to get in contact with her, but couldn't, and would end up notifying police and asking for a welfare check. Investigators arrived on scene and noticed that the cars were in the driveway, a for sale sign was out front, and the house lights were on. They peered into the house and could see a pot on the stove, hear a dog barking, and even feel the uncomfortable heat billowing from the doors and windows. Something was terribly amiss. They made a decision that, given the pressing circumstances, they needed to make immediate entry. They contacted the realtor, who confirmed that there should have been a lockbox with keys to the house, but that was gone. On the realtor's recommendation, they checked the vehicles to see if any were unlocked and had a garage door opener. As luck would have it, one vehicle was left open with a working opener. They pressed the button and made their way into what they quickly realized was a house of horrors. They entered the kitchen through the garage, continually announcing their presence. The pot on the stove, still simmering, the unbearable heat hitting them in waves. They noticed the groceries still on the ground. Some of the fresh food that needed refrigerating left rotting near the front door where Lisa had left them. They went upstairs, passing by bloodstains on the floor and the wall, getting closer to the laundry room where they could hear the dog howling. They looked down the end of the hallway on the second story and saw a pair of hands lying on the floor, and the realization that they were in a crime scene washed over them. They exited and immediately called the forensics team to the house. When they arrived, they immediately began securing evidence and trying to piece together what exactly happened and why. In the master bathroom, they found the rest of the couple placed in 2 plastic bins. Guy Sr.'s hands were removed at the wrists and left nearby on the exercise room floor. Both victims also had their arms and legs disarticulated, Guy Sr. at the waist and Mrs. Guy at the knees, and their limbs and torsos were placed in a toxic vat of chemicals to be dissolved. Each body had a large gash inflicted after death to allow the chemicals to seep more quickly into the body's main cavity. The only other part that wasn't there was Lisa's head. Mrs. Guy's head was removed, carried downstairs, placed in a pot on the stove, and heated, left to simmer for days now. At trial, the forensic examiner testified the head was not just severed, but broken off with force. Investigators found a litany of items that essentially told them the entire story. There were guns, wallets, and cash on the dining table, containers of chemicals in multiple rooms, blood spatter and pools on nearly every surface in the house. It looked like someone had just stopped right in the middle of cleaning up a crime scene, because that's exactly what happened. At some point, either during the attack or during the brutal handling of the corpses, Joel had sustained several deep cuts to his hands and to his left thumb. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Guy Jr. was seen in Walmart's first aid section, obtaining bandages and ointment for the wounds to his hands. He also purchased isopropyl alcohol and hydrogen peroxide. On Sunday, Guy Jr. drove back to Baton Rouge to have his wounds treated at the student clinic with the intention of coming back to finish the cleanup. He set a timed text message to send from his mother's phone to himself at some point while back in Louisiana to aid in his alibi. Before he could get back to Knoxville to finish his horrific plan, police had already become aware of the murders, and their investigation was well underway. One of the items collected by investigators was a maroon-colored backpack located on the floor by the bed in the guest room. Inside that backpack were some seemingly innocuous items like a calculator and an umbrella, but there were also some notebooks and printouts that weren't quite as harmless. These were printed diagrams showing how water heaters work, as well as a number of handwritten notes. These notes combined together would be referred to as the Book of Premeditation. Joel had written in fine detail his plans for how to commit his heinous acts, the disposal of his parents, the items he would need, as well as his motive. You see, this attack wasn't completely random in Joel Jr.'s eyes. Seeing that his financial lifeline was going to be severed, he came up with a demonic plan. The family had lots of assets, and Lisa had a $500,000 life insurance policy. However, that would get paid out to his father, so in Joel's mind, he had to not only kill Lisa, he would need to kill his father as well to become the primary beneficiary. And what better person to frame for everything than someone who couldn't defend themselves anymore? Joel's plan to frame his father for his heinous acts would leave him free and clear to enjoy his parents' finances and continue to live the responsibility-free life he was so accustomed to. The Knox County Sheriff's Department, the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Department, and the FBI cooperated to watch Joel Jr. in the days after the bodies were discovered. Seemingly, he was completely unaware that his plan was foiled. On November 29th, Joel Guy Jr. was arrested as he was getting into his car. After detaining him and searching his car, it became clear that he was planning to return to Knoxville to resume his plan. In the trunk of his car, investigators found a KitchenAid mixer with a meat grinding attachment, the exact same type of mixer and attachment that he detailed in his notes. He refused to cooperate with authorities and refused to waive his right to an extradition hearing. Eventually, he was successfully extradited back to Knox County, where he pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and filed a motion to serve as his own counsel. He would later state that he only wanted to represent himself so he could file a motion to receive the death penalty if he's found guilty. Judge Stephen Sword told him that he would let him argue that if he reinstated his lawyers, and Joel Jr. agreed. The prosecutor responded that they had no plans to seek the death penalty, no matter what Joel Jr. wanted. It was also discovered that nearly immediately after murdering his parents, Joel Jr. made large payments to his apartment complex, utilities, and his school to prepay for his expenses for quite some time. These payments came from the accounts of his father. On October 2nd, 2020, Joel Guy Jr. was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the brutal slaying of his parents. He was found guilty of 3 counts of felony murder, a separate charge for the death of a person while another felony is being committed. 1 count was for committing the murder of Lisa while he was already murdering Joel Sr., and the other 2 counts were for the deaths of both Joel Sr. and Lisa while committing theft. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of abuse of a corpse. Judge Sword sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences with the possibility of parole after 51 years, so that in the unlikely event that he is paroled after 51 years, he must then begin serving his second life term. He was also given another 4 years for the abuse of corpse charges. The earliest that Joel Jr. could be successfully released on parole is the year 2122, at which time he would be 134 years old, effectively ensuring that he could never be released. Joel Guy Jr. remains incarcerated at the Bledsoe County Correctional Complex in Pikeville, Tennessee, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life.